The ordinary soldiers of the Civil War. In the early hours before dawn, the air was thick with smoke and silence. Not the silence of peace, but the quiet that falls before a storm, the kind that makes a man's heart pound even when the battle is miles away. Amid the rolling hills of Virginia, thousands of ordinary men stirred in their camps, clutching rifles and letters from home, unaware that history would remember generals and strategies, yet rarely the faces of those who simply followed orders, marched, and prayed to survive. These are their stories, not the generals who commanded armies, nor the famous heroes etched in textbooks, but the common soldiers, the ones who woke before sunrise, cleaned their muskets, and faced the endless march of war. This is the story of sweat, fear, courage, and the quiet moments that shaped a nation. Chapter 1. Morning in the Camps. The dawn broke slowly over a frost-covered field. Private Samuel Harper of the 11th Virginia Infantry stirred in his thin blanket. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and listened to the low murmur of men waking, the distant clink of tin cups, and the occasional neigh of a horse. The smell of wet earth and cooking fires mingled with the smoke of last night's cannon practice. Samuel was 19. His hands were rough from months of drilling and long marches. Every day, the mundane rituals of camp life, the inspection of boots, the careful cleaning of a rifle, the filling of canteens, were punctuated by the uncertainty of battle. Today, he knew, might bring another skirmish. Tomorrow, perhaps, a march to an unknown town. But for now, the quiet morning seemed almost peaceful. Corporal Whitman moved past him, carrying a bundle of letters. "From home," he said, offering one to Samuel. Samuel's mother's familiar handwriting brought a brief comfort, a reminder of a life that seemed impossibly distant. He tucked the letter into his jacket and stood, joining the line of men assembling for morning roll call. The sergeant barked orders with a voice that tried to mask the fatigue he carried in his bones. "Line up! Check your gear! Today we march!" And so the ordinary soldiers began another day, their lives measured in footsteps, in letters from home, in the clatter of musket balls, and in the unrecorded acts of quiet courage. Chapter 2. The Long March. By mid-morning, the camp was alive with motion. The low murmur of men folding blankets and packing their sparse belongings gave way to the crunch of boots on frost-hardened earth. Samuel Harper shouldered his knapsack, heavy with a few changes of clothing, a tin cup, a blanket, and the ever-present rifle that seemed almost an extension of his arm. Around him, hundreds of ordinary soldiers moved in formation, the line stretching over the rolling hills like a living river of gray and brown coats. The march had begun. The officers rode ahead, swords glinting faintly in the weak sunlight, issuing orders that were more routine than informative. "Keep formation, watch your step, don't fall behind." Their words were repeated like echoes, but for the men on foot, marching meant something deeper. Hours of weary steps, the constant ache of muscles, the gnawing hunger from meager rations, and the ever-present fear that a battle might be waiting just beyond the next ridge. Samuel minded the farms and small towns he had passed over the last few weeks. Many had been abandoned, the fields trampled and scarred by armies moving in both directions. Some towns still held families, eyes wary as the soldiers passed, their hands clutching children or tucking letters into pockets. Samuel tried not to meet their gaze, though sometimes he couldn't help it. In their eyes, he saw the same exhaustion reflected back, the weight of survival, of uncertainty, of lives interrupted by a war they had little say in. The sun climbed higher, though it offered little warmth. The cold air burned the lungs with every breath, and the soldiers' fingers, exposed from gloves worn thin, grew numb. Corporal Whitman, walking alongside Samuel, remarked casually, "If we ever make it to Richmond without losing a few toes to frostbite, I'll call it a miracle." A small, bitter laugh ran down the line of men. Humor was rare, but in its brief appearances, it carried more weight than a full meal. By noon, the march became almost a rhythm, the monotony broken only by orders from the officers, or the occasional shout when someone stumbled in the uneven terrain. The men trudged through mud and shallow streams, their boots soaked, the weight of waterlogged shoes making every step an act of will. They sang little. Songs were for campfires at night, when hope could briefly flourish. Now each man was alone with his thoughts, counting steps, rehearsing the drills, praying that the next hill would hide no ambush. Around mid-afternoon, the line halted beside a small creek. The men collapsed on the banks, drinking slowly, careful not to spill water that had been hoarded in tin canteens. Lunch was a simple affair: hardtack, the dry biscuit that snapped under teeth and left dust on the tongue, and a small portion of salted pork, greasy and chewy. Many chewed in silence, listening to the soft rush of water and the occasional rustle of leaves. The soldiers' conversations were muted, the words weighed down by fatigue. Even humor had been replaced by quiet endurance. Samuel thought of home. He thought of the letter from his mother, tucked safely against his chest. It spoke of small victories, of crops planted, of neighbors who still tended to each other. It felt distant, a different world altogether, yet in that fleeting thought he found a measure of comfort. It reminded him why he kept marching, why he endured frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion, not for glory, not for medals, but for the hope that one day these ordinary days of war would end and the extraordinary life of peace might begin again. As the afternoon stretched on, the officers called the line to order. The men arose, stiff and aching, and resumed their march. The sun began to dip behind the distant hills, casting long shadows that seemed endless across the frozen landscape. Samuel's legs protested with every step, but still he moved forward, along with the thousands of other ordinary soldiers who bore the brunt of a conflict that would be recorded in history books, though rarely by name. By nightfall, the soldiers reached a small clearing to set up camp. Fires were lit, the flickering glow casting long shadows on weary faces. Dinner was minimal, more hardtack, a thin stew made from whatever provisions had survived the march. Around the fire, men murmured quietly, sharing stories of home, of loved ones, of strange encounters along the road. Samuel listened, contributing little, finding solace in the shared understanding of hardship. As the cold crept back into their bones, the soldiers crawled into blankets, huddling close for warmth. The night was quiet, except for the crackle of fire and the distant calls of owls. Samuel lay awake for a while, staring at the stars, thinking of the journey ahead and the battles yet to come. In that moment, he understood that history is not only made in moments of fame and glory, but also in the countless steps of ordinary men marching forward through exhaustion, fear, and the unknown. And so ended another day in the life of an ordinary soldier of the Civil War, a day marked by endurance, quiet courage, and the relentless march towards an uncertain tomorrow.
Chapter 3. First Skirmish. The morning mist clung to the valley like a thin veil, hiding the undulating terrain beneath a ghostly gray. The soldiers of the 11th Virginia Infantry had barely finished their breakfast of cold, hard-tack and bitter coffee when orders came down the line. "Prepare to advance! Skirmish ahead!" For ordinary soldiers like Samuel Harper, these words carried a weight that no drill could replicate. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, a mixture of dread, anticipation, and the raw instinct to survive. Around him, men adjusted their belts, checked their rifles, and whispered brief prayers. Some wrote hurried letters in their heads to mothers, sisters, and sweethearts far away. The march toward the skirmish was tense. The hills rose and fell like waves frozen in place, and every ridge could hide enemy forces. Scouts ahead reported movement, and the faint sound of distant musket fire began to punctuate the morning air. Samuel's heart pounded in rhythm with the echoing shots, quick, uneven, unpredictable. When the order finally came to halt, the soldiers formed a line behind a shallow rise, their muskets resting against their shoulders, powder horns ready. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he loaded his rifle, the cold metal biting his palms. Around him, men stood silently, faces pale but determined, sharing an unspoken bond. They were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The first shots rang out, sharp and metallic, bouncing off the nearby trees. Samuel's ears rang, and for a moment, time slowed. He saw a young private stumble, a crimson stain spreading across his sleeve, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The reality of war was sudden, brutal, and indiscriminate. The soldiers exchanged volleys with the enemy, the air thick with smoke, the smell of gunpowder sharp and acrid. Orders from the officers came fast, shouted above the roar of the rifles. "Hold the line! Don't advance! Fire at will!" Samuel obeyed, not out of courage, but because the drill drilled it into him. Discipline was survival. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Some men screamed, others fell silently, their faces frozen in fear or shock. Samuel's training helped him focus on the mechanics: load, aim, fire, reload. But the human mind struggles to process the chaos around it, and he felt the weight of the lives around him, the ordinary men who would never make headlines, yet whose presence shaped history just as profoundly as generals and strategies. Amid the smoke, Samuel glimpsed a familiar face, Corporal Whitman, shouting orders, dragging a wounded soldier to cover. The camaraderie of the ordinary soldiers shone brightest in these moments. Fear was shared, courage was shared, and the small acts of heroism, passing water, bandaging a wound, offering a word of reassurance, were what kept men alive more than any musket or cannon. By midday, the skirmish ended almost as abruptly as it had begun. The opposing line withdrew into the trees, leaving behind the shattered remnants of what had been a disciplined formation. Samuel looked around at the aftermath: fallen comrades, broken rifles, and scorched earth. There was no fanfare, no medals, just the ordinary soldiers, breathing heavily, exhausted, and silently mourning. Back at camp that evening, the men cleaned their weapons, tended to the wounded, and wrote letters home describing the skirmish with careful vagueness. They would downplay the fear, the chaos, and the death, preserving in their words a dignity they could not always feel. Samuel, sitting by the fire, opened the letter from his mother once more. The gentle words of home contrasted sharply with the morning's horrors, but they reminded him why he marched, why he endured, and why ordinary men mattered in a war remembered mostly for generals and grand strategies. The night fell quietly, but sleep was slow in coming. Each ordinary soldier replayed the day in his mind, thinking of what had been lost, what had been survived, and what tomorrow might bring. For Samuel, the lesson was clear. Bravery was not always about heroics or glory. It was about enduring another day, holding the line, and carrying the weight of history in silent, steadfast resolve.
Chapter 4: Life Between Battles. After the skirmish, the soldiers trudged back to camp, their bodies sore and minds still echoing with the morning's chaos. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a heavy, persistent fatigue. Samuel Harper's legs ached, his fingers stiff from loading muskets and gripping wet ropes. But the war did not allow for rest beyond the necessities. The ordinary soldiers quickly returned to the routines that made life in camp bearable, if not comfortable. The first task was the mundane but essential, cleaning weapons. Muskets, rifles, and bayonets had to be scrubbed of blood, dirt, and powder residue. The process was tedious, but there was an almost meditative quality to it. Samuel sat cross-legged on the ground, brushing the barrel of his musket with a rag dipped in hot water and sand. Around him, other men worked in silence, occasionally exchanging quiet words about home, weather, or rumors of the next battle. Food came next, though it was meager and unappetizing. Hardtack, salted pork, and occasionally beans or cornmeal stew formed the bulk of their diet. Fires crackled as men huddled around them, trying to coax warmth from the flames. The taste was monotonous, but sharing a meal, even a humble one, brought a small sense of community. Corporal Whitman, always attentive to morale, passed around a few slices of dried fruit, which were savored like gold. Letters were a lifeline. Samuel pulled out the note from his mother, carefully unfolding the paper to read her words again. Others wrote feverishly, sometimes to a sweetheart, sometimes to a sibling or parent, filling pages with mundane news or heartfelt longing. The letters were often censored, whether by camp regulations or the soldiers themselves. They carefully omitted fears, defeats, or grim details. Yet these correspondences bridged the gap between the war's harsh reality and the life that continued back home. Amid the monotony, men found ways to cope with boredom and stress. Games of cards or dice were common, laughter echoing briefly across the camp. Songs were sung quietly, sometimes off-key, but always with energy that belied the day's fatigue. Samuel listened to a group hum a folk tune from Virginia, and for a moment the war seemed distant. Evening brought its own rituals. The men prepared for night, laying out blankets, checking for wet spots, and sharing whispered stories. The quiet was both a comfort and a reminder of the fragility of life. Any sudden noise could bring panic. Fires were kept low to avoid attracting enemy scouts, and lanterns were used sparingly. Samuel sat by a small flame, nibbling on the last of the hardtack and reflecting on the day. Sleep was never guaranteed. In the darkness, Samuel often imagined the battlefield replaying in his mind, the flash of musket fire, the cries of men, the acrid smell of gunpowder. But he had learned to find small rituals to soothe the mind, adjusting the blanket, cleaning his boots one last time, whispering a prayer for his family. These routines gave him a sense of control, however fleeting, in a world dominated by chaos. Even in moments of quiet, the ordinary soldiers were acutely aware of the war's unpredictability. Scouts and messengers brought rumors of troop movements, and officers called meetings to brief the men on potential marches. Decisions that seemed abstract to the soldiers, the positioning of divisions, the capture of strategic hills, the timing of reinforcements, had immediate consequences for those on the ground. For Samuel and his comrades, strategy meant little compared to the tangible challenges of staying warm, fed, and alive. As the night deepened, the camp settled into a rhythm of soft breathing, the occasional cough, the distant call of an owl. Samuel closed his eyes, allowing the memories of home and the faces of fallen comrades to mingle in his mind. Despite the fatigue and fear, he felt a quiet pride. He He was part of something larger than himself, a story of endurance and courage woven by ordinary men who lived through extraordinary circumstances. The war would continue, the marches would resume, and battles would come again. Yet in these moments between fights, life carried on in small, profound ways. Letters were written, fires were tended, songs were sung, and friendships deepened. These ordinary moments, seemingly insignificant in the grand narrative of history, were the threads that held the soldiers together, giving them the strength to face another day. And so the ordinary soldiers of the Civil War endured, not through fame or glory, but through the quiet persistence of daily life, the unwavering bonds between comrades, and the hope that someday peace would return.